My name is Shannon, and I spent much of my life in the Canadian Foreign Service, a good part of it in Japan. And while I was working in Tokyo at the Canadian Embassy, it occurred to me that I really didn't know very much about my own country's history with Japan. And I began asking myself a question, which is, when did Canadians first begin going westward across the Pacific? I knew, of course, about Japanese who came to Canada, but I knew almost nothing about movement the other way. So I began digging, and out popped this wonderful cast of intriguing characters who became the book Finding Japan. Well, one of the most things that surprised me most in the book was to realize that Canadian connections with Japan began so early. They actually started in 1848, during the era of the Tokugawa shoguns, when Japan was still closed to the outside world. And a young half-Aboriginal son of a Hudson Bay trader who grew up not far from Vancouver, Langley, Kamloops, decided to smuggle himself into Japan disguised as a shipwrecked sailor, which was a highly dangerous thing to do at the time. And he survived. And he has a wonderful story to tell. And the strange thing is that we hardly know of him in this country. His name is Ronald McDonald. He went on a whaling ship and he landed off the coast of Hokkaido. He really didn't know very much about Japan. He was there to find out. He was there because he was just intrigued with Japan. I think because it was closed. He wanted to see what was in Japan. People who came later, in the 1870s, for example, in the same decade that Japanese were coming to Canada, by then Japan had opened up. It was the Meiji Era. Emperor Meiji had replaced the shogun and Japan was modernizing. And so foreigners began to come because they were attracted by what was going on in Japan. It was a very exciting time. And there were several Canadians who arrived in that time. One, a particularly interesting young man who was in one of the treaty ports, because of course that's where foreigners had to live, was in the treaty ports. He decided he didn't like the treaty ports very much, and he went camping out at a Buddhist temple, and he was discovered by Fukuzawa Yukichi, who was the leading Meiji Era modernizer. It was a huge stroke of luck, and this young man ended up teaching at Keio University. Formal relations between Canada and Japan started in 1929, when Canada and Japan exchanged ministers. We had formal diplomatic relations. But what surprised me was that long before that happened, we had a very rich history with Japan that began, well, in the middle of the 19th century with this young half-Aboriginal man, with the people who went in the 1870s, with the people who went after the Canadian Railway went through, traders, people who went to teach in Japan. There was a lot of contact before we established formal relations between the two countries. Because Japan had been closed, there were Japanese who were interested in meeting Westerners and getting to know them. And these Westerners were intrigued with Japan. One of the most interesting things for me was to realize that the Canadian Pacific Railway was not just a railway to get to Vancouver, which didn't even exist. It was a transportation route across North America to Asia, to Japan. And it was about ships as much as trains. At the same time that was happening, there was also a very big interest in Europe and North America in Japan, in Japanese art and Japanese culture. It was the era of what we call Japonism, which influenced art. You find, for example, that the legendary William Van Horn, who built the railway, was also a very well-known collector of Japanese porcelain. So there he was, laying down the track across the country, and at the same time talking to his agents to buy Japanese porcelains. And we still have some of those in the museum in Montreal. Canada's engagement with Asia really began with Japan. Japan was our first substantive connection across the Pacific, and it was an extremely important one all through the 20th century, particularly on the trade front, trade and economic front, but increasingly in other areas as well, cultural and so forth. So Japan is really Canada's first friend, first partner in Asia, and one of the things I wanted to do in the book was to see how that really got started, because I think it's important to know what the roots are of these connections. And I have every reason to believe that this connection is going to continue to grow in the years ahead. We've just started free trade negotiations between Canada and Japan. Well, one of the most interesting things about the beginning of Canada-Japan trade is that it was Japanese who seem to have got the ball rolling. First Ito Hirobumi when he crossed the country, and then a man named Tamura Shinkichi, who came from Kobe in 1888, started a small export-import business in Vancouver and became the real pioneer in Canada-Japan trade. His company was called Tamura Shokai, and it was housed in the Tamura building that is still on Powell Street and is a Vancouver landmark. Herbert Norman is known in Canada as a man who committed suicide in 1957 because he had been hounded by the communist witch hunt of Senator McCarthy in the early 1950s. But in fact, he is a man who had a very strong role to play in the after the Pacific War in Japan. He was born in Japan, and he wrote a very well-known book about Japan. And after the war, he was the best known expert on Japan in North America. So he went to Japan shortly after the war and was working there, and he was very highly respected by Japanese scholars and so forth. This is an opportunity in the book to explore the Japanese side of Herbert Norman, which has been rather ignored because of the more sensational story of the charges of him being a spy, which I should add, no one has ever produced any evidence that he was. It's a bit of a sad story, but the Japan part is very interesting. If someone is interested in Pacific history and in something that is new and a different way of looking at it, and is interested even in doing a little time travel through the eyes of some rather interesting people, then have a look at Finding Japan.